Classic films of the 20s.
15% raises, a closed shop, a 52-hour week, and something else, a role in setting their own wages and conditions. How could New York garment manufacturers afford the better wages and conditions the wastemakers' strike had won?
The larger inside shops could, in fact, afford to give larger wage increases because they produced year-round. Most of the times they weren't affected by the seasonality. They had more of a standardized relationship with the textile firms that provided them raw materials. And all these sorts of factors allowed them to give wage increases. And also in the larger shops, the wage increases would be immediately reflected in the price increases in the garments.
The wastemakers had made their point. If one worker asked for a raise, she could always be replaced with someone else willing to work for less. But workers bargaining together and, if necessary, striking together could win a share of the fruits of higher prices and higher productivity. The unions had made them strong. We asked economic analyst Richard Gill how the ILG used the supply and demand for labor to get wage raises.
Certainly one important impact of the union was on working conditions, which were sometimes quite intolerable in those days. Unions, of course, also had an impact on wages. To analyze their effect, you have to compare wage determination according to the ordinary laws of supply and demand with wage determination when unions intervene. Basically, without unions, wages would be determined by the intersection of the business firm's demand curve for that particular kind of labor and the supply curve of such labor. This demand curve reflects two things: consumer demand for the product, garments, these firms are producing, and the productivity of the labor employed, roughly how much each added laborer will contribute to increased garment production. The supply curve reflects the availability of this particular kind of labor and the willingness of workers to supply their labor at various wage rates. Supply and demand are equated at this intersection of the two curves. We get an equilibrium wage here and the quantity of labor that will be employed here. Now, in the case of the garment industry at the turn of the century, what you had was an enormous availability of cheap immigrant labor willing to work at virtually any wage in order to survive. What this meant technically is that you had a supply curve of labor that looked like this. At this very low wage, businesses could hire a virtually unlimited amount of labor. Naturally, they had no motive or need to pay higher wages. They would operate here. Now, what the ILG did in effect was simply to insist that the wage be raised from here to, say, here. If employers objected, the union was capable of withdrawing virtually the entire labor force from the market, which of course is exactly what strikes attempt to do. So the employers decided to settle for this higher wage. The standard of living of the employed garment workers improved, though of course at a certain cost. For other things equal, when wages are raised above the market level, fewer workers will be employed. And in fact, we can see in our diagram that employment has now fallen from here to here. Few people doubt that the growth of unions had mainly beneficial effects in the early sweatshop days. Even then, however, there were some costs. In later decades, these costs sometimes became substantial.
August 16th, 1966. Vietnam War protesters clashed with the House Un-American Activities Committee. The prime interest rate rose to 6%. And Willie Mays hit his 534th home run. But the New York Herald Tribune didn't cover any of these stories. Because as of 5 p.m., August 16th, 1966, in the midst of a 113-day strike, the century-old New York Herald Tribune breathed its last.
There's no sense screaming about why or what or who did it or who loused the thing up and who didn't louse it up. I mean, it's all gone. It's all academic now. The paper's gone, that's all. Nothing else to say.
Clay Felker ran the Herald Tribune's Sunday magazine.
The whole place was a ferment of creativity because it had very high standards and it emphasized good writing, and it was in the business of discovering and supporting talent, journalistic talent. And there were a wonderful collection of writers.
When an honorable old paper like the Herald Tribune goes down in a strike, people start to ask questions about union responsibility, like who killed the Herald Tribune? The death of the Herald Tribune was the climax of a labor management battle which pitted the paper against the International Typographical Union's Local 6, Big Six to people in the trade, a union, one scholar said, had the most complete control over job conditions of any union in the world. In 1963, Big Six President Bertram Powers had led New York's newspaper unions out on a 114-day strike. A strike which drew fire even from normally close labor allies.
It is clear in the case of the New York newspaper strike that the local of the International Typographical Union and its president, Bertram Powers, insofar as anyone can understand his position, are attempting to impose a settlement which could shut down several newspapers in New York and throw thousands out of work.
The printers returned to work in April of 1963. But 2 years later, as 1965 contract negotiations drew near, New York newspapers and their union member employees were starting to feel the bite of computer technology. Newspaper copy, which took a linotyper hours, would take minutes by computer. Automated and computerized typesetting machinery could cost the jobs of union printers. But higher wages without the increased productivity of automation could force the less profitable papers out of business. That would mean jobs, too. What would the union do? Printers Union Chief Bertram Powers.
And we were faced with the demand for use of computerized typesetting, the use of film, a complete revolution in the composer's room, which we understood we'd have to handle it. And then but we got into a dispute with the publishers about production and about...
In order to achieve ends that are beneficial to our membership, we also sometimes get very